Hello, everybody. We're going to be focusing on Act 1 of an Inspector Goole in this lesson. And what we're going to be looking at specifically in Act 1 is Mr Birling and the exchanges between him and the new character we're going to be introduced to, who's called Inspector Goole, who's a police inspector. So if you have a little look, you'll see that our learning questions for today are: can I understand and analyse the dynamic between Inspector Goole and Mr Birling in Act 1? And can I analyse some of Mr Birling's attitudes and values and start to link these to capitalism? Now, Inspector Goole is a really political play, but bearing in mind that I don't want you to write a history essay for me. I don't want to front load all your learning with loads and loads of political stuff. So we're just going to kind of build on what we know week by week. And today is, I've mentioned this word capitalism. And any of you who've been really paying attention in citizenship may know what capitalism means already. If you take a hearty interest in the news and current affairs, you'll probably have a good understanding of what capitalism is. I'm not going to bang on about it in today's lesson, but we'll just think about Mr Birling's attitudes and what his attitudes and values are and how they link into this theme, so that when we do kind of whack up a definition of capitalism, you'll have hopefully a really good understanding of what it looks like in practice. So what I want you to do before we carry on with this video is to watch the next section of the play. So again, I'm going to put the link underneath, but also if you click the eye for information up above as well, that should give you a link to the video that I've recommended for your first watch through. What you need to do is scroll forward to 9 minutes and 30. That's where we got to last time, and you're going to be watching just under 10 minutes of it. It's not very much at all, actually. You're going to be looking to start where this lovely lady Edna announces the inspector has arrived, until Sheila comes back into the dining room. And just a little tip for you for this one, or hint, it'd be really useful if you can follow along in your play script, please, because they have changed a few of the lines and adapted them, and they have removed a few of the lines, which I think are quite important or significant. So try to follow along in your play script whilst you are watching. Right, so I'll leave you to do that for 10 minutes, and I'll see you back here in a bit. Bye-bye. Okay, so you can see up here we've got a subheading, and this is a little bit of assessment objective 3 of social and historical context. So an Inspector Goole is a particular genre of play, and there's different names for this genre. I always call it murder mystery. Because I love the TV programmes nowadays. I love things like Poirot and Miss Marple and Midsummer Murders and things like that. I always call it a murder mystery. Other people call it whodunit, so you can see that up above, they're just under the title of genre. So exactly the same, you know, there's a crime has been committed and the detective or the police inspector is supposed to solve who committed the crime. And you can see that it's spelled all wrong, and that's fine. That's just the way that it's spelled. That's the convention. Sometimes these kinds of mystery dramas, crime mysteries, are referred to as country house mysteries. And when the play first came out in 1945, these kind of plays of this genre, the whodunit genre, were extremely popular in the West End. So that's the theatre district of London. So it kind of is like a really old-fashioned genre. I guess even in 1945, the genre had been around for a while, but it was still really popular. And I guess that's because people like to try and solve the crime along with the detective at the same time and think who's guilty. And that's what an Inspector Goole is based on. And you can see that the clue is in the name of the play as well. As a totally different side note, back in 1945, the other most popular genre for West End plays was musical theatre. So those two are kind of equal tops. That's what people would pay their good money to go and see, and people would dress up in really, really formal evening wear to go to the theatre as well. So I've popped down here, the playwright J B Priestley exploits this popular genre to create a play with a political message. So although for all intents and purposes it seems to be a murder mystery play, actually he's trying to make a much stronger political message, and he's kind of disguising that in this really popular genre. If you're still not quite sure what the genre is, you can see some of the images that I've put around this page here. So up here, this is a still from a play called The Mousetrap. And this is the longest running play in London's West End. It was first premiered in 1951 in London's West End, and it's been on in London at some time in the West End, and even up until this very day. And The Mousetrap was written by Agatha Christie, so probably the most famous writer in the genre of murder mystery. This is one of her famous novels, its very first Poirot novel, so obviously it's not a play, but hopefully you can see here this big country house in the background. So the idea is you get loads of posh people stuck in a house together, and kind of no way of escaping from that house, and the whole crime is solved just by interviewing all the people who are within that house, normally gathered for some kind of grand social occasion. So that's the kind of thing you can see as kind of what I mean by a country house mystery. And then maybe, as some of you have played this board game called Cluedo, where someone called Mr Black is murdered, and you have to work out who committed the crime, what room they committed the crime in, and what instruments they used to commit the crime. So you may well have played this board game called Cluedo, and that's based on this country house murder mystery genre, like an Inspector Goole. So that's what that's all about. And as I said, J B Priestley is being quite cunning because he's disguising his political message in this very popular genre of play. So he's almost kind of tricking people to come to the theatre. They think they're going to see a murder mystery, but actually they get a big dose of political rhetoric as well. Okay, so just a few reminders, something which I've mentioned but I haven't been dead specific about. So it may be a good idea for you to pause this and make notes in your book if you haven't got this down already. So an Inspector Goole is set in the springtime of the year 1912. So it's set just before the Titanic sails and 2 years before the start of World War I. Okay, so that's when it's set. So nearly 110 years from now, but still in the past, even compared to when J B Priestley wrote the play. The second point to remember, and this is important, is an Inspector Goole was written and first performed in 1945, after both World War I and World War II. And there was a reason why J B Priestley was being quite political and why he was looking for political change at around about that time. Really good, easy little task for you to do. You could pause this video and do this quickly now, is remind yourselves, find out and write down in your notes what the dates were for World War I and what the dates were for World War II. You've got a couple of dates up there, so you could do a bit of maths and work out some of those dates, but you're going to need some other dates as well. So really important for your pub quiz general knowledge, but also really important for the social and historical context, or the AO3 assessment objective 3 for this play as well. So go and find those out now, please. Okay, so before we do some analysis, let's make some notes on Inspector Goole. So what we learn about him in this section of the scene, first of all, is what the actor playing him should look like and how he should conduct himself on the stage. So the casting director needs to find a man in his 50s to play Inspector Goole, a man in his 50s. And hopefully you noticed that that's exactly the same age as Mr. Birling. Mr. Birling is also a man in his 50s as well. And Mrs. Birling, of course, is about 50. Then Inspector Goole is described as not necessarily a large man, but he has to create this impression of massiveness, solidity, and purposefulness. Okay, so he doesn't have to be a huge bloke. He doesn't have to be kind of big and fat or really muscular, nothing like that. But he has to have a real presence about him. So he needs to be massiveness and solidity. So not the kind of person that you could push over really easily. So someone who's got this really good presence in the room. And this idea of him being purposeful means he does use silence, but he is always trying to find something out. And actually the next quotation makes us think about that more. He speaks carefully, weightily. So he's not the kind of man who will waste words by jabbering away. He's a man who will be quite blunt and to the point. He's the kind of person that you listen to when they're talking to you. I'm going to skip this one for now, but this one here is really interesting. He has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So let's think about that one as I glare down the camera at you and think about his name, because his name is Goole, as he tells us a little bit later in the play, Goole. And you will notice, hopefully, that Goole is a homophone for the word ghoul, Ghoul. And a ghoul is a kind of ghost, but a ghoul, Goul, is the kind of ghost that feeds on souls. It feeds on human souls. I think the word ghoul, when he says Goole, and those audience members who bought the programme will see that name. It's got those two O's in the middle of it, unlike this spelling of the ghost. And I always think those two O's look like two staring eyes, and that helps me to remember this quotation down here: disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. So if we put these two ideas together, that he kind of feeds on souls, and his name looks like these two staring eyes, two O's in the middle. We're getting this idea of almost like a supernatural figure. The inspector is someone who looks deep into your eyes as if he's about to steal your soul or suck your soul from you. The last interpretation of his name, Goole, I read it once in a York Notes, so you can take this with a very large pinch of salt if you like. But Goole actually is a fishing village up in the northeast of England on the River Humber. And some people say that it's significant that he's called Inspector Goole because it's almost as if he is fishing for clues. Okay, so if you don't like that interpretation, just ignore it. But I read that in a copy of the York Notes, and I always put it out there just in case anyone thinks it's marvellous and they can do something with it. And then the final quotation I've picked out for Inspector Goole so far is this one here, because we begin to see his political point of view, and it's really different from Mr. Birling's. He says about Eva Smith asking for a pay rise, "Isn't it better to ask for the earth than to take it?" So that's what he says. Isn't it better to ask for the earth than to take it? He's suggesting there that Mr. Birling and other businessmen like Mr Birling, are very, very quick just to take what they want. He's almost saying greedy. Whereas someone in that kind of weaker position, like the worker Eva Smith, she needs to ask to try and make her life a little bit better. Okay, so we're going to do some annotation now. So if we have a look, there's nothing really, really complicated here. So I'm going to go through this quite quickly for you. So in this section, Edna comes in. Please, sir, an inspector's called. An inspector? What kind of inspector? A police inspector. He says his name's Inspector Goole. So this little exchange here is really helping to establish the genre. It is a crime drama or a murder mystery or a country house mystery, as we've discussed already. The repetition of that word inspector. What you might want to think about when we've worked through the whole play is to come back to that word inspector, and because you might think, is he just inspecting a crime or a death which has happened, or is he inspecting the Birlings in a different way? And perhaps that's another reason for that repetition here. The next one that I've highlighted is the one that we've just talked about. So if you didn't get all your annotations down previously, now would be a really good time. So his name's Inspector Goole. So it's a homophone for the word ghoul, a type of ghost that feasts on souls. So in the next section, we've got some stage directions, which we've annotated and talked about in previous lesson. Birling says, all right, Edna, show him in here. Give us some more light. Edna does. And then she goes out. I'm still on the bench. It may be something about a warrant. So if you remember when it says, give us some more light, at the beginning in the stage directions, the lighting starts off as pink and intimate. And when I analysed that for you before, we talked about the pink lighting being kind of quite disguising. It makes everything look pretty. It makes people look warm and healthy, and so on. At this point, the lighting, if you look back at that quotation from earlier, it becomes brighter, harsher. So it changes from a pink light to a white light here. And remember, we talked about how it's almost like that interrogation lamp. So I'll just get my lamp in again. So it's like the interrogation lamp where someone shines that light into your face and tries to confuse you and disorientate you by using the light. So the lighting change into that brighter, harsher, whiter light. Okay, on the next line, Gerald agrees with Mr Birling. Yeah, it was sure to be about a warrant, unless Eric's been up to something. That would be awkward, wouldn't it? And he's referencing the conversation they've just had. Mr Birling, remember, is hoping to become Sir Arthur. So he's hoping that he's going to get a knighthood in the honours list because he used to be Lord Mayor of Bromley. But Eric gets quite upset by this. He says, here, what do you mean? He's uneasy. So he's feeling quite uncomfortable. Oh, Gerald says, only something we were talking about when you were out, a joke, really. And Eric is still uneasy. Well, I don't think it's very funny. So I'm not going to give you the answer to this because obviously I've read and studied this play many times before and I know the answer. But I want you to think about Eric and why is he behaving in such an upset way. So as the play unfolds, think about why Eric is so edgy, why he might be a little bit afraid of the police coming to his home. So just remember this moment as we watch and read on in the play. So going down a little bit further then, I've just put here, the inspector enters, Edna goes, closing the door. Inspector doesn't need to be a big man. Massiveness, solidity, purposefulness, man in his 50s, dressed in a plain darkish suit of the period. He speaks carefully, weightily, and has a disconcerting habit of looking hard at the person he addresses before actually speaking. And hopefully you have made those notes already on a separate page on the inspector, just putting the inspector in the middle of the bubble, annotating round with some of these quotations. So as I said previously, what I do notice is that there are quite a few similarities between the Inspector Goole, and Mr Birling himself. They're both in their 50s, and they both seem to have done well in their career. The inspector's worked his way up to the rank of inspector, so that's quite a good promotion for a man in his position, whereas Mr Birling seems to have a very profitable company, and he's marrying his daughter off to someone from a higher social class. So both men seem to have done quite well in their career. However, they've both chosen really divergent, different career paths, whereas Birling has firmly gone into a profit-making business, so he wants to make as much money as he can in manufacturing. Inspector Goole has chosen to pursue a kind of a public service by joining the police. Now, I think still nowadays, the police force kind of prides itself on employing like normal working class people from a working class background. So hopefully you can see there that Inspector Goole and Mr Birling have probably come from really similar backgrounds. They both come from the working classes. They've both done well in their respective jobs, and they've both worked their way up, as I said previously. However, as a policeman, you're not going to be interested in profit. You're going to be interested in making sure that people get justice. So that's quite different aims and ambitions there. Okay, so think about that. There are quite a lot of parallels between Mr Birling and the inspector. But let's have a think about some stagecraft. So this is assessment objective 2. So we're analysing stagecraft here. And I've put down here, is this a power play? Yeah, because I do think that Birling starts his power play straight away, really. The inspector questions Mr Birling. Yes, sit down, Inspector. The inspector sits. It says in the stage direction, thank you, sir. Have a glass of port or a little whisky? No, thank you, Mr Birling. I'm on duty. You're new, aren't you? Yes, sir, only recently transferred. So if we think about that stagecraft, here's the first one. If Mr Birling is standing up and he invites the inspector to sit down, immediately that creates a difference between the two of them. If I'm sitting down as I am now and someone comes in and they're standing up, immediately they're in a more powerful position than me, and they're kind of looking down on me. And me having to look up at someone kind of makes me feel smaller and less significant, and maybe even slightly vulnerable. And you will notice when you watch the clip earlier, they changed this bit a little bit, didn't they? Mr Birling says, Mr Birling says, sit down, Inspector. And the inspector says, no, thank you, sir. I prefer to stand. And in a way, I quite liked that change, because it shows that the inspector is going to take no nonsense from Mr Birling and not play the same kind of game as him. Another interpretation, however, could be that Birling at this point is already seated from where he was talking to Gerald. So Birling himself is seated. And when he says to the inspector, sit down, Inspector, he's kind of bringing the inspector down to his level. And if that's the interpretation that the director of the play is going to take, that gives us a slightly different meaning as well, doesn't it? Because what Mr Birling is trying to do there is to kind of get chummy, get pally, be all friendly with the inspector and win him over on his own terms. And actually that goes really well with this quotation here, doesn't it? Have a glass of port or a little whiskey. So because he's being all chummy, all friendly with the inspector, and they're both sitting down at the dinner table, if the inspector accepts that alcoholic drink. It's like, oh, we can be all matey because this is very informal. And if I say anything where it's just two chums having a drink, it's not official police business. Whereas the inspector says, no, thank you, Mr. Birling. Again, the inspector shows, I'm not playing your games, Mr. Birling. I'm not drinking on duty. I'm going to conduct this interview in a professional manner. I'm not here for 10 minutes for a nice jolly chat. Okay, so Mr. Birling is trying to encourage the inspector to act in a kind of quite an unprofessional way there, but the inspector is having no truck with that. So think about it. If the inspector had drunk and Mr. Birling had admitted that he'd done something, Mr. Birling's lawyers would be absolutely all over that if it actually came to court. Okay. I've annotated here, can you notice that they're quite blunt exchanges between these two? So it's quite like short and snappy. Mr. Birling, yes, sit down, Inspector. Thank you, sir. Have a glass of port. No, thank you. I'm on duty. You're new, aren't you? Yes, sir. And you recently transferred. So they're quite blunt exchanges. Comes across as both men being like borderline rude to each other. Yet the two of them do use polite address terms. So the inspector calls Mr. Birling sir, and the inspector calls him Mr. Birling, and Mr. Birling refers to him as inspector. So they're perfectly respectful towards one another, but they're doing it in quite a blunt way. Okay, so again, that could show a similarity between them, the fact that they're both quite blunt with the way that they talk. Okay, so Mr. Birling has tried now, hasn't he, to show his power over the inspector. He's tried to use their body positions to try and get a more powerful position over him. He's tried to get the inspector to act quite unprofessionally by drinking whilst he's on duty, to try and get a little bit chummy with the inspector. Neither of those seem to have worked so far. So the third trick that he's going to try is to try and do something called pulling rank. Mr. Birling is basically looking at the inspector and saying to him, do you know who I am? That's kind of what he's trying to do, and that's what pulling rank means. He's basically saying to the inspector, I'm more important than you. I've got more status than you. I've got more important friends than you. If I decide to, I can get you fired. He doesn't actually say that, but the way that he is talking, he's insinuating that. So let's have a look at how he does that. So he says here, I was an alderman for years and Lord Mayor 2 years ago, and I'm still on the bench. So it's almost like a list of three. It would be, but he carries on, doesn't he? So it's a list, and it gets more important in a way as it goes on. So an alderman is kind of like a counsellor, and I don't mean a counsellor like for mental health. I mean someone who works for the council, but someone who is kind of like the deputy in the council, so really, really high up in the council, an alderman. So an alderman would be in charge of kind of civic offices, so spending local government money, for example, saying which roads could be built or not, possibly talking about how local money is going to be used to fund the police, for example. Okay, so Mr. Birling was an alderman for years, and he would do that in addition to his normal job running the factory and, well, owning the factory. Then he was Lord Mayor 2 years ago. Okay, so again, something he's really, really proud of. And again, back in 1912, that would literally kind of put him in charge of like the local administration in Brumley. So he is one of the leading lights in the town of, or the city of Brumley. You can imagine the mayor of a big northern or Midlands city. It's a really, really important role now, and that's what Birling is doing at the same time as carrying on his business. So he is a really important man. You can see how he's trying to pull rank here. And then the last one he comes up with, I'm still on the bench, and what that means is that he is a magistrate. So a magistrate is kind of like a judge, but not in the Crown Court. It would be in the local court, the magistrates' court. So that means that Mr. Birling could do things like issue search warrants or arrest warrants for certain criminals. He would be someone who would decide sentencing for someone who committed a minor crime. So you can see being a magistrate is a really important role, which carries with it a lot of responsibility. And again, by being a magistrate, you do have some powers to make the job of a policeman quite difficult, which is probably why he mentions it now. So as I said, to kind of sum that up, he is saying, like, do you know who I am? This is who I am. Okay, he says, I know the Bromley police officers pretty well. I thought I'd never seen you before. So he's saying, this is me, but I've never even heard of you. It's becoming quite threatening. Okay, the inspector, though, he still doesn't rise to it. So whatever Birling throws at him, the inspector just takes it all in his stride. So the inspector goes on to tell Mr. Birling why he is here. I'd like some information, if you don't mind, Mr. Birling. 2 hours ago, a young woman died in the infirmary. So the infirmary is the local hospital. She'd been taken there this afternoon because she'd swallowed a lot of strong disinfectant. Burnt her inside out, of course. So this is quite emotive, but it's also very, very blunt indeed. Will it become significant? Yes, it will become significant, the way that this girl killed herself, the way she committed suicide. She swallowed strong disinfectant. Now, back in 1912, she definitely wasn't following Donald Trump's coronavirus advice. So that wasn't why she did it. But it would be a very, very slow, painful death swallowing disinfectant. So would the caustic soda in a disinfectant would kind of like burn your throat and burn the whole of your digestive tract. It would be a slow, painful death. So it's quite emotive describing it like that. And then also quite emotive is they did everything she could. She was in great agony here, but even though the doctors and nurses did everything they couldn't revive her. So hopefully what you noticed on the video was the contrast between Eric and Mr. Birling here. Eric, involuntarily, it means he doesn't even think about saying it. It's just his gut instinct. He goes, oh my God, he's so horrified by what he's heard, that a young woman would take her life in such a disgusting way. He's so horrified, he just blurts it out. Whereas Mr. Birling is rather impatient. It's a horrid business, but what's it got to do with me? I don't understand why you should come here, Inspector. So really, really different. For Mr. Birling, this young woman's tragic death is just an inconvenience that is wasting his time, whereas Eric really feels it, doesn't he? Okay, so it's not really got anything to do with our learning question, the difference between Eric and Birling, but definitely really, really useful when we look at Eric more closely in their relationship, potential essay question that could come up. The inspector shuts Mr. Birling up. That makes a happy change, doesn't it? Because nobody's managed to shut Mr. Birling up this evening so far. It's normally Mr. Birling who is getting other people to be quiet. How does the inspector get him to shut up? He cuts through massively. So here the inspector really shows that purposefulness that was in the stage directions. He shows his power as a policeman by interrupting Mr. Birling. I've been round to the room she had, and she'd left a letter there, a sort of diary. Like a lot of these young women who get into various kinds of trouble, she'd used more than one name, but her original name, her real name, was Eva Smith. I'm not going to discuss the significance of her name today, but I will in future lessons. So can you have a think about why the surname Smith might be really significant in the play? And what the first name Eva or Ava could be short for, what it could represent. So start thinking about that now, please. So Mr. Birling becomes thoughtful when he hears that name. And now he is actually beginning to get drawn into the inspector's investigation here. He's thinking slowly. I seem to remember hearing that name, Eva Smith, and he can't quite grasp why he should remember that name. The inspector helps Mr. Birling out. She was employed at your works. And here we begin to learn a little bit about capitalism, what I'm talking about the nature of running a business. And Mr. Birling says, oh, that's it, is it? Well, we've several hundred young women there, you know, and they keep changing. So it's this idea, the nature of his business is he's got a constantly rotating workforce. What could this suggest? Actually, perhaps he's not paying enough money and young women leave to get a better job. Maybe it could show the fact that when people become disgruntled, workers become disgruntled, there's nothing for them, so they just move on rather than making a fuss. It could be that the young women get married and then become housewives, although to be honest, if you're working class, you probably need to retain that job anyway. But Mr. Birling seems to think this is just something that comes as part and parcel of running a business, the fact that your staff should turn over so rapidly. I'd argue that if you are a responsible capitalist, then you should look after your workforce. And if you look after your workforce, the turnover of staff shouldn't be so high. And that means in the long run, you'll actually save money because you won't have to spend all this money on training new people all the time. But that's not something that Mr. Birling seems to appreciate. He doesn't seem to be a responsible business owner, and we'll find out more about that as this scene progresses. The inspector shows Mr. Birling a photograph. Gerald and Eric try to have a look at it, but the inspector says no, one line of inquiry at a time. And just a little small task for you to do. Why do you think the inspector only allows Mr. Birling to see the picture? Do you think that could be significant later on? So there's just something for you to have a think about there. Gerald is annoyed. Why shouldn't I see this girl's photograph, Inspector? And the inspector is cool. He looks hard at him. So we're back to that staring into people's souls kind of idea there again, aren't we? And he says there might be a reason why you shouldn't see her photo. And the same goes for Eric. Going on a little bit further, the inspector says, it's the way I like to go to work. One person, one line of inquiry at a time, otherwise there's a muddle. And Birling says, I see sensible, really. And here I just notice again these similar speech patterns that they have. So the lines are always really similar length. They're both quite blunt, and they seem to have not exactly a mutual respect, but they are talking almost as equals or trying to. But Mr. Birling is becoming unsettled. He moves restlessly and then turns. He's not quite the comfortable man that he was at the beginning of the play. Okay, so Mr. Birling does remember her now. She was one of my employees. I discharged her. Is that why she committed suicide? When was this, Father? Just keep quiet, Eric. Don't get excited. So he's still patronising Eric. This girl left us nearly 2 years ago. Let me see, it must have been in the autumn of 1910. Yes, end of September 1910. So here's a little task that I would like you to do, perhaps in your exercise books. Keep a timeline for what happens to Eva Smith throughout the play. So, like her involvement in the play starts end of September 1910, about 18 months, 2 years ago. Gerald is the soul of discretion. Look here, sir, wouldn't you rather I was out of this? So it sounds as if the inspector might bring up something which is a bit of a touchy subject for Mr. Birling. So Gerald discreetly, being the gentleman that he is, tries to absent himself from the room. But Mr. Birling says, no, I don't mind at all. And we see Mr. Birling trying to pull rank again. This is Mr. Gerald Croft, son of Sir George Croft, Crofts Limited. And he's trying to pull rank in several ways. First of all, Gerald Croft, remember, he's quite the man about town. We found out earlier he's almost like a local celebrity, Gerald Croft. That doesn't seem to work. So he's like the son of Sir George Croft. So he's dropping that upper class name in there and that title. And that still doesn't hit the mark with the inspector. Crofts Limited, so the big local business, the rival business to Birling and Company. And that still doesn't seem to have any impact on the inspector. So all this pulling rank is not really working. The inspector says, Mr. Gerald Croft, eh? Yes, instantly. We've been modestly celebrating his engagement to my daughter, Sheila. So here, Birling's going off on another tack, a different tack again. Perhaps this time he's trying to make the inspector feel guilty. Say, come on, get a move on, because we're in the middle of a family celebration. But again, that still doesn't move the inspector in any kind of way. The inspector says, I see Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Birling. And Gerald's smiling, isn't he? He's so smug. And the inspector tries to wipe that smug look off his face. The inspector says gravely, and gravely means really, really seriously. And obviously gravely also has connotations of death. Then I'd prefer you to stay. So we get a little foreshadowing here. Remember that word, foreshadowing. So a hint or clue as to something that's going to happen later. So that word gravely, which means he's being very, very serious and saying, I'd prefer you to stay, after establishing Mr. Croft is going to marry Miss Sheila Birling. It's giving us some real clues, real hints as to what's going to unfold later on in the play. So again, try and remember that bit of foreshadowing there. Okay, so we do have this contrast between Gerald smiling in his smug manner and the inspector speaking gravely, so seriously, and reminding everyone that someone's died in the way that he says it. That surprises Gerald. So even Gerald is being disturbed a little bit as well, the normally very smug and self-assured Gerald. Okay, so on this page, we really start getting into one of the big themes of the play, and that's the theme of responsibility. And we're back to our learning question here. What are Mr. Birling's attitudes? And he's got a really weird attitude towards responsibility. So let's see what's going on. He's impatient still. Look, there's nothing mysterious or scandalous about this business, not as far as I'm concerned. It's perfectly straightforward. It happened more than 18 months ago, nearly 2 years ago. Obviously, it has nothing whatever to do with the wretched girl's suicide, Inspector? So he's still trying to be quite chummy with the inspector. And the inspector says, no, sir, I can't agree with you here. So Birling starts acting as if what happened to this girl, the fact that she ended up committing suicide, he had absolutely nothing to do with it. It's not his responsibility. The inspector disagrees, and this is why. Because what happened to her then may have determined what happened to her afterward. And what happened to her afterward may have driven her to suicide, a chain of events. So what the inspector's doing here is hinting that you can share responsibility for what happens to someone. He's not saying, Mr Birling, yeah, what happened 2 years ago was entirely your fault. What he's saying is what you did, the way that you acted, Mr Birling, it set off this chain of events, this chain reaction. So yeah, actually you are involved and you are responsible, partially at least, for what happened. That's what the inspector's saying. Mr Birling doesn't want to accept this. When you put it like that, there is something in what you say still. I can't accept any responsibility. What I'd like you guys to do, please, is could you add that quotation onto your page where you're collecting quotes about Mr. Birling. It's a real key Birling attitude and a key Birling quotation. I can't accept any responsibility. He says if we were all responsible for everything that happened to everybody we'd had anything to do with, it would be very awkward, wouldn't it? And the inspector agrees with him, very awkward. We'd all be in an impossible position, wouldn't we? And the inspector doesn't go to agree with that, but Eric does. By Jove, yes. And as you were saying, Dad, a man has to look after himself. And this one too, a man has to look after himself. You could add that to your Mr. Birling page of quotations too. This shows another one of Mr. Birling's attitudes. Mr. Birling's all like, if you look after yourself and you look after your family, then it does not matter what happens to anybody else. And I'm hoping that none of you agree with that attitude. Yeah, I would agree. Put your family first, definitely. But don't only look after yourself. There's a whole community around you and a whole world around you. So Mr. Birling's attitude, even Mr. Birling seems a little bit embarrassed, a little bit ashamed of what he said. And he doesn't really want Eric to say that in front of the inspector. Yes, well, we needn't go into all that. You kind of get this sense of shame, maybe embarrassment, definitely there. So let's see what Birling says. Oh, I'd just been giving these young men a little good advice. Now, about this girl, Eva Smith, I remember her quite well now. She was a lively, good-looking girl, country bred, I fancy. And she'd been working in one of our machine shops for over a year. A good worker, too. In fact, the foreman there told me he was ready to promote her into what we call a leading operator, head of a small group of girls. But after they came back from their holidays that August, they were all rather restless. And they suddenly decided to ask for more money. They were averaging about 22 and 6, which was neither more nor less than is paid generally in our industry. They wanted the rates raised so they could average about 25 shillings a week. I refused, of course. So let's have a look at this. The first thing is, I think it'd be really useful for you to start tracking similarities between Sheila and Eva Smith. Obviously, this has got nothing to do with today's learning question, but when we look at Sheila, and she'll be up next, there are lots and lots of similarities between Eva Smith and Sheila. And one of them is they're both pretty girls, good-looking girls. Lively and good looking. So that sounds like the Sheila that we've met so far. The difference is Sheila doesn't have to work for a living, Eva Smith does. And you can also tell from this description she was a lively, good looking girl. Mr. Birling seems as if he might be quite fond of her, and he might have looked at Eva Smith and she might have reminded him of his own daughter too. However, when he says country bred, I fancy, it's almost like she's a prize horse or something that he's got racing in a horse race. And remember what we learned in that BBC video last time, that the kind of the middle classes, definitely the upper classes, looked down on the working classes and thought that they were almost like a different race. Having said that, Mr. Birling does come from the working class, so we take that with a pinch of salt. The fact that she's a good worker and she was about to be promoted, that indicates that she was probably going to get a pay rise and more status within her job anyway. So in a way, like if she was only thinking of herself, and her family, unlike Mr Birling's attitude, just up here, if she was only looking after herself, she didn't need to go on strike. She just needed to keep her mouth shut for a couple of weeks and wait for the promotion, and she'd be getting more money and probably less work with that responsibility as well. But she doesn't, and that shows us something about her personality. And then this idea, they wanted their rates rise so they could make more money, so they'd have more money to take home. This really shows Mr Birling's capitalist attitudes, that actually that money, that capital is another word for money. Money is more important than people, that money is king, really. That's what capitalism is all about, profit rules. The inspector says, why? Birling's like, did you say why? Yes, why did you refuse? And Birling says, well, Inspector, I don't see it's any concern of yours how I choose to run my business, is it now? And I guess it's not really. So I've just put the question down here. Is it the role of the police to hold businessmen accountable? No, probably not, as long as they're paying their taxes properly and not doing anything illegal. It's not a police matter. So when the inspector said why, you have to question why indeed a policeman would think that was a relevant question. But the inspector argues it might be, you know. So hopefully you're beginning to feel a little bit suspicious in a way of the inspector himself here, and thinking about the way that he's conducting this interview. But also on a kind of a more moral point, whose role is it, would you say, to police what businessmen and women get up to? Who is like the person who holds business people responsible? Is it the government? Should it be the police? Is it the media? Or should they just make profit at any cost? What do you think? So Birling says to the inspector, I don't like that tone when the inspector says it is his business. So Mr Birling is being quite threatening now, and you can see they're being quite combative here. So it's like their speech is almost like a boxing match, isn't it? They're throwing comments and questions at each other. So just a little aside now. So when it says the girls were earning 22 shillings, 22 and 6, that's short for 22 shillings and 6 pence. And in Edwardian money, that's worth £1.12. It's not very, very much at all. Now, what I did, I ran this through an inflation calculator, and that's equal to £129.46 in today's money, which when you look at it like that doesn't sound too bad, especially not to a 14 or 15-year-old, I guess. But to put that into context, that works out at £3.23 per hour. And that's only if Mr Birling's workers are working a 40-hour week, which is what the average people who are on full-time work nowadays. It's very likely that they worked a lot longer hours than that, actually, which obviously would take this rate down. So they're earning the equivalent in today's money of £129.46 per week, which is not a lot. If you wanted to rent a flat in Reading, for example, that would probably cost you about £800 a month. So on these wages, you wouldn't even be able to rent a flat in Reading. So that means you might have to do a house share, so you probably only have a room. And even if you only had a house share, you're probably still talking about £600 a month, and that you could probably just about rent your room, but that wouldn't leave you any money at all for food, no money to go to the cinema or anything like that. So just to give you a bit of kind of perspective on that. So what they were asking for was 25 shillings, so that's £1.25. So they wanted little pay rise, 37p pay rise per week. So what they were asking for, £1.25 in their money, would be worth £143.85 in today's money. So that would give them a pay rise of that would take their pay up to £3.60 an hour. So that's an 11% pay rise. When you look at 11%, that does seem quite a lot. Normally pay rises kind of about 3% or 5%, something like that, when people have worked really, really well for a year. So do you think an 11% pay rise is fair? Do you think that Mr Birling could have met them halfway? Said, well, I'm not going to give you £1.25, but how about £1.20? So you could say, or I'll give you 23 shillings maybe, or 24 shillings instead of 22. So maybe he could have met them halfway to keep them happy. And I kind of discussed this previously, didn't I? If you pay your employees more than other similar businesses, you won't get that massive staff turnover, will you? You won't have to be constantly training new staff. They'll be loyal to your company because they want to stay and work for you. So I think J B Priestley is sending out a message here. Like, you can be a good employee, you can still be a capitalist, you can still make profit and keep your people happy. You can actually have it both ways. Why not? And nowadays, know that like some of the top tech companies such as Google and Microsoft really, really look after their employees because they want to retain the best possible staff and attract the best possible staff. I guess it's different in a factory. Anyway, again, just to give us a bit of context, though, here are the minimum wages from now. So obviously, if you're an apprentice, you're still training. So actually, those apprentice wages, although they're still more, considerably more than what the girls are earning, they are quite close to what these girls are earning. And if you're under 18, similarly, it's not too much more. But bear in mind that these are probably women who've got families to support, rent pay, not just kids who are still living at home with their parents. So if you have a look at the 25s and overs, the minimum wage at the moment is £8.72 an hour. And you can see that that is well over double even what the girls were asking for their pay rise here. And nowadays, people are still arguing that this minimum wage isn't even a living wage, that if you're paid the minimum wage, it doesn't give you enough money to pay for your housing costs and your electricity and your heating and your food and your kids' school uniforms and things like that. So hopefully that gives you a bit of perspective. This money is tight. This is not enough money for these people to live properly. To live happy, fulfilled lives at all when we compare it to the money for nowadays. Let's finish our annotation. Not much on this page, you'll be very happy to know. So Birling says, it's my duty to keep labour costs down. Okay, and this is what I was just talking about, really. He says, if I'd agreed to this demand for a new rate, we'd have added 12% to our labour costs. Does that satisfy you? I refused. So he wouldn't give them a pay rise because that means there'll be less profit. When you're running a company, you have your costs and then you have your profit. And the higher your costs, the lower your profit. So he wants to keep his costs down and his profit up. So that's what Mr Birling's talking about. And I've just said notice these similar speech patterns. They're kind of echoing each other again. You asked me a question. You asked me a question before that. Unnecessary question. It's my duty to ask questions. Can you see how they're like echoing each other? It's my duty to keep labour costs down, and off he goes. Eric kind of gets it though. I refused to give them a pay rise. I told we were paying the usual rates. If they didn't like those rates, they could go and work somewhere else. It's a free country, I told them. And Eric says it isn't if you can't go and work somewhere else. The inspector says quite so. Birling says, look, you just keep out of this. You hadn't even started at the works when it happened. They went on a strike. It didn't last long. Eric goes on to say he could have kept her on instead of throwing her out. I call it tough luck. And Eric gets it. He's like, well, don't you want to keep your best workers? You said she was a good worker. Why wouldn't you want to keep her? Give her a pay rise. But he seems like a much more thoughtful man. So why on earth would you sack one of your best workers? It just doesn't make sense to him. Not even like from a human perspective, not at all. But even from a business perspective, to Eric, it doesn't seem to make sense. Anyway, Birling says there were 4 or 5 ringleaders. And Eva Smith, she'd had a lot to say, far too much. She had to go. And I like Eva Smith here. She, as I said previously, she probably knew she was up for a pay rise. So she just had to sit tight for a couple of weeks and ignore the strike. She didn't have to get involved, but she showed solidarity with the other girls. She led the strike. She's a feisty character with a lot to say. She wants to get her point across, but she suffered for it in the end by losing her job and her promotion. Okay, so Eric, as I said, could have kept her on. A tough luck. And Birling says, if you don't come down sharply on these people, they'd soon be asking for the earth. And I've just put this is highly ironic, isn't it, as the inspector points out to us here. Because Birling is also asking for the earth, isn't it? He's asking for the labour costs to be kept right down. He wants to keep labour costs down as low as he can. And the inspector points out the irony of his comment. It's better to ask for the earth than to take it. And what he means by this is that Birling is just helping himself to whatever he can because he is in that position of power. Birling does not like being told off by the inspector. He stares at him. What did you say your name was, Inspector? Goole, Goole. Remember what I said about those double O's? The eyes looking at you. And Birling tries to pull rank again. How'd you get on with our Chief Constable, Colonel Roberts? I don't see much of him, says Goole. Perhaps I ought to warn you he's an old friend of mine. So he's getting really threatening now. I see him fairly frequently. We play golf together sometimes at the West Bromley. And the inspector answers dryly, I don't play golf. What's the significance of golf? Golf is associated with the higher middle classes who are trying to copy the upper classes, playing a round of golf. Birling says, I didn't suppose you did. So he didn't think that Inspector Goole was the kind of person who would play golf. Golf is also a game which is played by businessmen, and you'll all have seen Donald Trump at his Mar-a-Lago golf course. He always says he makes his business deals on the golf course, and you can imagine the Birling trying to almost kind of bribe Colonel Roberts, the Chief Constable, with a round of golf and a slap-up meal afterwards, schmoozing with the police and kind of getting the police in your pocket, which means that you can almost be beyond the law because you've got that kind of power. A little bit of humour from the inspector. I think it's a damn shame, says Eric, who's still upset about the girl, but the inspector pretends that he thinks Eric's talking about playing golf. No, Eric corrects him. Why shouldn't they try for higher wages? We try for the highest possible prices. Why should she have been sacked because she'd a bit more spirit than the others? You said yourself she was a good worker. I'd have let her stay. So you can see Eric here taking the side of the working people. And remember the staging at the beginning. And Eric was seated nearest to the audience, so perhaps Priestley did that to make that connection between Eric and the audience. Like, Eric's the one that you want to be on his side. There's no barrier between you and Eric. There's no table blocking your relationship with Eric. He's saying to the audience there. And then we find out a little bit more about Eric. That's something this public school and varsity life you've had doesn't seem to teach you. And I've just popped up here. This lets the audience know that Eric has been educated at a public school. So we call public schools our very, very biggest, poshest, private school. So he's been somewhere like Eton, so public school, somewhere like Eton College, where he would have been brushing shoulders with the upper classes and the wealthy people. And the varsity life, that shows that Eric must have gone to university as well. So Mr Birling is quite sneering about public school and varsity life. You don't get taught like how to run a business there. Well, we could have told Mr Birling there, but it could suggest that all this public school was to do with Mrs Birling doing the right thing by Eric against Mr Birling's better judgment. So you can see that Mr Birling, his money, has given Eric all the advantages that he himself, Mr Birling, didn't have as a working class boy who's pulled himself up through the ranks. And then again, we've got this irony of responsibilities. It's about time you learned to face a few responsibilities. He means about running a business and about that responsibility for making profit, for making as much money as you can. But this is highly ironic, because when you're taking responsibility for making money, you're not taking any responsibility for making sure that your employees can afford a roof over their head, or taking any responsibilities for making sure your employees have got a good meal at the end of the day and that they can live in good condition. So it's highly ironic that for Mr Birling, he sees Eric's responsibility, his own responsibility, about making profit by being harsh on your employees in a business, whereas actually your responsibility should come to humanity first. In the middle of this COVID-19 crisis, we are seeing this argument all the time. What's more important, stopping people from dying of the disease, or getting our money-driven economy, the shops, the businesses open again so we can all pay tax? And it is a really, really political point. What's more important, people or money? And again, you'll have your own view on that and about how we can find the right balance. But although this is an old play, it's still so relevant nowadays. Okay, we are nearly there. Hurrah. So Mr Birling says it's quite cold. I don't see we need to tell the inspector anything more. In fact, there's nothing I can tell him. I told the girl to clear out and she went. That's the last I heard of her. Have you any idea what happened to her after that? Get into trouble. So get into trouble is a euphemism for getting pregnant. Go on the streets, and that's a euphemism for prostitution. So these really, really horrible assumptions that Mr Birling makes about what options there are for a working class girl. If this is what he thought would happen to her, that she was either going to get herself pregnant or fall into prostitution because that was the only role that was available for her after she was fired by him, it makes him firing her even more heartless and harsh and cruel and irresponsible, if you like. If he knew that it was possible that that might happen, what a harsh man. And also the way that he just pitches it out there. I've put he is blasé as he makes his comments, so he just throws it out there without any emotion, without any empathy. So this girl, who we find out as it goes on has more and more similarities with his own daughter, he's just acting as though it's perfectly understandable and reasonable that she would have fallen into prostitution as a result of losing her job with him. And that's disturbing and quite disgusting when he says that he is a responsible man. So just a question for you to think about before we round things off for this lesson. How does J B Priestley sorry, it doesn't even make sense. How does J B Priestley make a similar point about being a responsible business owner to Charles Dickens in A Christmas Carol? So ignore that bit there. They're making quite a similar point, even though they both come from really different political backgrounds, making a really similar point there. How should you act if you're a business owner? Okay, so we're going to make two summaries here. And if you want to, I'll talk you through what I've written here. Hopefully, it's just a recap of all the points. You might want to pause this and either copy this into your books or make some notes on this, like get it down to bullet points or whatever. So one part of the learning question was, can I analyse some of Mr Birling's attitudes and values and start to link these to capitalism? So this is what I wrote for this one. Priestley adopted the popular theatre genre of whodunit to lure in his audience, make his political points. So it's not really got anything to do with attitudes and values, but really important to remember. Priestley exposes Mr Birling's attitudes towards business and money, which are in line with capitalist values. In order to keep profits as high as possible, it is necessary to keep costs as low as possible. Staff wages are one of the biggest costs to any business, so a pay rise for workers will cut into a business's profits. Eric, unlike Mr Birling, shows more empathy to the workers. He recognises that a good worker like Eva Smith is an asset to a company, and someone who's an asset to a company deserves to be rewarded. Eric also sees the parallels between a businessman negotiating a deal and workers negotiating higher pay. So Eric says, we try for the highest prices, why shouldn't they try for the highest wages? And then really, really quickly answering the question that I just said, Priestley makes similar points that Dickens does in A Christmas Carol. A businessman has a responsibility not just for profit, but also to their workers and to their local community. So it shouldn't just be about profit. And then I've kind of written this almost like as an essay. So the second part of the learning question, can I understand and analyse the dynamic between Inspector Goole and Mr Birling in Act 1? And so I'll just read through this for you. It's kind of like a mini essay. Priestley creates a fraught dynamic between Goole and Birling. So fraught means kind of tense and uncomfortable. They're men of a similar age and similar social background, both working class men who have worked their way up, but in very different careers. Whilst they seem to show each other respect, sir, yes, Inspector, their exchanges are quite antagonistic, and they seem to echo each other's harsh, blunt, yet down-to-earth statements. In order to show his power, Mr Birling invites the inspector to sit down, whilst Birling remains standing. Mr Birling also invites Goole to share a whisky or port. Had he indulged in an alcoholic drink, Goole would have no recourse should Mr Birling admit to anything he might later regret. When these first two tactics fail, Birling persistently attempts to pull rank on Goole. He mentions his cosy golfing relationship with the chief constable as a thinly veiled threat to Goole's career. He makes a point of indicating Gerald Croft's upper-class social and business connections. Furthermore, Birling reminds Goole that not only was he an alderman for years, but he was also Lord Mayor and still on the bench. Here, Priestley highlights that Birling has powerful connections throughout Bromley. As alderman and mayor, Birling would have powers in deciding policy within local government, including perhaps the funding of the Bromley police. As a magistrate on the bench, he has the power in Bromley's legal process. This, as Birling makes clear to Gerald, might involve giving local police a search or arrest warrant. Birling makes it clear to Goole that he has the power to make the inspector's job more difficult with the influence he can exert within his community. Okay, so hopefully you can see that I've analysed that dynamic between Goole and Birling there. And showed a good understanding of what the playwright is trying to achieve, the way that he's kind of positioning the two men and the way he's got the two men talking to each other. So next time we're going to be doing some more close analysis of Sheila. So I will see you for the next lesson. Goodbye for now.